Thank you everybody for turning out for our second webinar of 2021, and it's been a reasonably challenging start to the year for many people, I know, but I hope this session today should be of interest to many people. A few bits of housekeeping. As Kate said, please mute yourself if you aren't muted already. If you are happy to change and able to change your display name to represent who you are and the organisation you're representing, then that would be very useful for us, so we can keep track on who's turned up. The webinar is being recorded and we will share excerpts and the whole thing online through our YouTube channel after the event. So just want to check you're happy with that. And then finally, there is a chat box on Zoom, as you probably know by now. Please do use that to post questions or comments or discuss the topics being presented or talked about through the session today. As is usual, I'm going to kick off with a few introductory slides, an update on the Community Resilience Fund, and a couple of introductory slides for the session we're running today, which is looking at the economic impact of COVID-19. And I think we're only probably starting to understand the economic impacts, but there's already some clear patterns and trends emerging, which we will no doubt delve into through the session. So next slide, Kate, please. So the next slide is an update on Oxfordshire Community Foundation's response to date. As of last week, we have given out over £900,000 worth in grants across the county to community groups and charities who are helping with the response through a whole range of different things: food, benefits, advice, companionship, support for medicines distributions, and a whole range of other things that are helping people stay at home and self-isolate if they need to, or get through what is a very, very challenging period for many people. The full list of who we've awarded money to is available on our website via download, and will be being updated every time we do a new grants round. We are not open at the moment, but OCVA do have a round open, so do investigate that if you haven't done already. Moving on then to the economic impacts. This is an update of a slide I think we shared at the end of last year, or we certainly published in an insight report showing the increase in unemployment at the start of the pandemic last year. And that increase has been sustained across the county. We know it was nearly 150% increase across Oxfordshire. And I think in some ways that's a worrying statistic, but the overall unemployment levels are still lower than, for example, the post the financial crisis in 2008-9. But behind those figures, obviously, a huge number of people who are furloughed. We estimate that there's something like 76,000 people who have jobs in Oxfordshire that are insecure. And we know that when the furlough scheme ends, whether that's the end of March or whether the government put that back further, some of those jobs are going to disappear and there's going to be another surge in the unemployment rate. The next slide, we've talked a lot and heard a lot anecdotally about young people and the impact on young people of the pandemic and the lockdown. And this graph and some other data we have shows that youth unemployment has gone up quite considerably and above overall unemployment levels, both nationally and in Oxfordshire. And this picks out a number of wards in Oxfordshire that have been particularly hard hit by rising youth unemployment. But we also know that nationally, the 46% of the increase in unemployment across the country is accounted for by young people. And given they represent just 11% of the workforce, that means that they're something like 4 times more likely than the rest of the population to have lost their work as a result of COVID and the lockdown. So it's hard data supporting the reports we've heard about the impacts of young people on COVID and the lockdown, added alongside the information we've seen in the press about risks to young people's services and so forth. And the next slide is mostly drawn from an online tool that Simon in our team is incredibly good at using. And he's going to be running a session on 7th of April for people who want to understand how they can use data better to support your case, to understand your local environment, and to make the case for investment in your demographic group or in your geographical area. So do sign up for that session if you're interested, and urge others to come along and make use of the tool, because it can be a very powerful way of communicating the impact and data around your area. So on to today's session. We have 3 people attending today. First up in just a minute or so will be Mark Fransham, or Dr. Mark Fransham. I'm not going to read out his job title, but he is one of those people who has the rare ability to combine being a data geek with also having a very strong ability to communicate that data and the impact and import of that data in very human terms. So I'm sure he's going to give us a very, very interesting talk in just a minute or so. Second up, I will be interviewing Mandy Richards from the Agnes Smith Advice Centre about some of the frontline impacts we've seen from COVID and lockdown and the work they're doing in Blackbird Leys. And then finally, we'll have Richard Rosser from B4, a business networking organisation, talking about some of the work businesses have been doing and some of the impacts on businesses in Oxfordshire of the economic downturn associated with the pandemic. And then at the end, there will be a Q&A, so do post questions in the chat box, do post comments, and I'm sure there'll be a lively discussion there, which we'll try and pick up on at the end. So thank you to everyone for turning out, and thank you in particular to our speakers. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Mark Fransham.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Fabulous to be introduced as a data geek. I certainly hope I don't let you down on that front or any other. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk today. I am just going to share a few slides as I talk, if I can. If I can find them, actually. Okay, that's strange. It's disappeared momentarily. Oh, here we go. I think I've just found them again. Sorry.
It'd probably be me suggesting you had some technical ability that led to that.
Yeah, exactly. What a smooth start that is. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Can you see those slides now? Yeah, fantastic. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to try and talk for certainly no more than 15 minutes, hopefully a little bit less, about the economic impact of coronavirus in Oxfordshire. And I know, my brief for this was, I know that a lot of the people on this call have been doing some work to kind of try and address the immediate impacts of coronavirus. So my talk is trying to think a little bit beyond, I guess, the immediate impacts of coronavirus and what might happen in the future and the sort of issues that we might face. So as Adrian says, I'm from the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford University. I'm a researcher and a lecturer there. And my interests are in kind of income inequality between places and poverty and housing and population change. Some of you may know me from a previous life where I worked for 10 years as a social statistician for Oxford City Council before I headed off into academia. So I've got a long affiliation with Oxford and Oxfordshire, and it's a pleasure to be back here to be talking about it again. Okay, so let's just kind of lay out the land. So I guess the first thing to say is that this has been an extremely tumultuous decade or so. We've had 2 global crises, the global financial crisis in 07-08, and then the coronavirus pandemic of 2020-21. And in between those 2 things, we've had a national political crisis of Brexit in the middle as well, which, whatever you think of Brexit, has eaten up a lot of political capital, seen off 2 prime ministers, seen a referendum and 2 general elections, all fought around that issue. So it has been really quite an incredible period of history that we've lived through here and are living through. Social outcomes over this period have not been very rosy at all. Of course, we've kind of lived through a period of austerity and fiscal consolidation with lots of spending cuts in the public arena. But in terms of actual outcomes, there have been 2 particularly striking things that have occurred over this period. So there was the very slow recovery from the global financial crisis and very slow recovery of household incomes and wages during that period. So, the rate of growth in wages over the 2010s was, the lowest that had been seen for a very, very long time. And secondly, in terms of health, we've seen a complete slowdown in improvements in mortality rates in the UK, such that actually for women living in the poorest areas in the UK, life expectancy has actually fallen over the last 10 years, which is again something that we haven't seen for a long time. So the coronavirus pandemic, I guess, really comes on top of a really a tumultuous period, and in some ways quite a difficult period, for the UK. Coronavirus itself has obviously had very wide health, social, and economic impacts. Obviously, the number of people who have died. On top of that, the number of people who are suffering long-term complications, even if they survive coronavirus, the social impacts of long periods of isolation, as well as the economic impacts that I will focus on today. And most of these, although we kind of started out with some rhetoric at the start of the coronavirus pandemic about all being in it together, and in many ways we were all confined to home and so forth. Actually, the impacts, as we've seen, have been really unequally distributed by age, sex, class, ethnic group, and by place. So there's all sorts of things that could be talked about, but there's three things that I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to talk about employment, about housing, and about incomes from social security. Okay, so in terms of employment, you've just seen a version of this chart from Adrian. The impact on claims that are made for unemployment benefit, universal credit, as it's now called, was really dramatic. So you can see here that this is the number of claims just across Oxfordshire, and that big tip up is between March and May 2020, where the number increased from around about 7,000 to more like 17,000, just in a period of a couple of months. It was really, really dramatic, an incredible increase in a very short period of time. And this is something that's been sustained as well. You can see from this chart, it's fallen a little bit over that period, but really it hasn't fallen very much since May of 2021. So that's 8 months now. This also hides lots of other stuff that's going on. It obviously hides people who are on the furlough scheme, but I'll talk about some numbers on that in a moment. But it only includes people who have wanted to make a claim for unemployment benefit, and are also kind of willing and able to look for work. So there'll be people within who have lost their jobs who for whatever reason don't want to claim unemployment benefit, and so there'll be an additional number of people on top of this that we don't see in the numbers. These kind of increases have been seen across different groups for both men and women. There was a slightly higher increase for men claiming unemployment benefit than there was for women, but traditionally men have been more likely to claim unemployment benefit. And in terms of age, you can see again that the increase in claims for unemployment increased across all age groups that we have data on in Oxfordshire. You can't quite tell it from this chart, but actually there are some slightly different patterns in terms of the rate of increase across different age groups. So 16 to 24-year-olds make up the smallest absolute number of claimants for unemployment benefit, but they actually, in proportional terms, saw the largest increase in claims. So in terms of the furlough scheme, here's what we know at the moment. So at the peak of the furlough scheme last year, an enormous proportion of employments were furloughed. So over a quarter of all employments in Oxfordshire were furloughed at that point. So that was nearly 95,000 employments. There's a reason, and there was a reasonable kind of even geographic distribution across the county, a slightly higher rate in Cherwell district. And then the latest data we have on this now is up to November of 2020, where that had fallen to 11% of employments that were furloughed, so 37,000. Again, still with Cherwell with one of the slightly highest rates, but broadly a kind of even geographic distribution. And differently to claims for unemployment benefit, the take-up of the furlough scheme amongst women was actually slightly higher than for men, which is, as I say, different to the take-up for unemployment benefit. So we don't actually know at the moment, we don't have reliable figures about what has happened in this latest kind of post-Christmas lockdown. I think we can expect that number of employments that have been furloughed will have increased again. But this kind of 11% figure is kind of was the kind of lowest it got essentially over this period. So still, in the least restrictive point of the coronavirus restrictions, still about 1 in 9 employments were furloughed in the county. And just to kind of make the point, I guess, if we go back to this slide here, we can see that in terms of unemployment benefit, there's about kind of 16,000 people currently claiming unemployment benefit, but there are 37,000, or probably more than that now, but there were in November 37,000 people on furlough. So if a proportion, if even a relatively small proportion of those furloughed employments end up becoming people who are unemployed, then there's potentially another very large increase in unemployment coming down the track. In terms of kind of who's on furlough, we don't have very good local data on this. We've got data for the southeast and for the countries. We don't have ideal data locally, but nationally we know that the take-up rate is higher for 18 to 24-year-olds, so it's 18% compared to 14% at national average. And I guess will not be a surprise. In the southeast, we know that over half of employments are accounted for by just 3 sectors, so hospitality, wholesale and retail, and arts, entertainment and recreation. Perhaps not a surprise, given that we know that those have been subject to the most significant restrictions. So just kind of looking ahead at the employment picture, as Adrian's already said, really, the extent of job losses are really unclear at the moment. The furlough is freezing a portion of the labour market as at March of 2020, and we don't know what the labour market in those sectors is going to look like, in later on this year when things start to be, restrictions start to be released. The uncertainty, the outlook is uncertain for retail, hospitality and arts and entertainment. I think we all hope that a lot of that will return, and it will return to the same extent as it did before. Certainly there's, I think, a lot of pent-up demand for meeting up and getting back out to concerts and down to the pub and all of that. But to what extent that will really be possible, and to what extent people will be willing to do that, we don't know. And I think in Oxford and Oxfordshire in particular, there's also the question of the international tourist market as well. I think we can probably see a big uptick in the domestic tourism market, but in Oxford in particular, it has a massive kind of visitor economy that is much larger than the domestic population can sustain. And so if there's if there's large reductions in international visitors, you can see that hitting Oxfordshire, those sectors in Oxfordshire, perhaps harder than it might hit other places in the country. Obviously, there's been a particular impact on young people. So that's both in terms of educational opportunities that then so for people now who are kind of suffering in their education, later down the line might impact on their labour market opportunities, on the jobs that they can get. But also for young people in the labour market right now, some of them have had a very damaging start to their career, and may need additional support, or may suffer very long-term scarring. One thing I didn't say is that, in terms of the kind of geographic patterns of unemployment, it is very much that the neighbourhoods, the places that had high rates of unemployment before the pandemic have been hit the hardest. And so, it's those places, those places perhaps least able to cope that have suffered the most, and again, might need support looking forward. Okay, so I think I've used about 10 minutes of my time. Sorry, Adrian?
So I'll just say you've got 3 or 4 minutes, and I'm really keen you have time to cover both of the other 2 topics. But
yes, I was just thinking that. So let me whiz through those quickly. Thank you, Adrian. Okay, so 2 other things I wanted to talk about very quickly. One is, first one is housing. So as we know, in Oxfordshire and Oxford in particular, pre-pandemic, there's a very tight housing market. Lots more low-income households living in private rented housing than was previously the case. Was reduced state support for housing costs. So the kind of rate of housing benefit or local housing allowance that could be claimed for support with housing costs have been restricted since 2013, and increasingly that was losing value compared to market rents, and obviously high rates of homelessness as well. In terms of interventions that took place in the pandemic, there were mortgage holidays and a moratorium on evictions, and everyone in approach to rough sleeping, and there was a restoration of the local housing allowance that provides the state support for help with housing costs. That was restored back to market rates. So there's quite a big increase in the amount that people could claim towards their housing costs. But looking ahead in terms of housing, just to think about what might happen next. So despite this kind of increase in support for housing costs, there may be households who are really struggling with debt and rent arrears. And that could be for 2 reasons. One is that they haven't claimed the support to which they were entitled, but also the housing costs that can be claimed for are restricted to the kind of lower end of the market. So for households who had relatively high rental costs and were maybe claiming support with that for the first time, they may have found that actually the support that they could get didn't cover their entire housing costs, and they may have really struggled to cover their housing costs as a result. There's also a question about when the moratorium on evictions is removed, whether some households that have been struggling with their housing costs and falling into rent arrears might end up being evicted, and so we might see a large increase in people presenting themselves as homeless at that point. In terms of social security incomes then, so before the pandemic, there was a significant erosion of the state basic minimum that was available to families due to a bunch of different welfare reforms that took place that kind of reduced both the amount that people could claim and also reduced the periods over which they could claim due to a 5-week wait for universal credit, and also due to sanctions. And this led to a kind of rise in child poverty, particularly with large families at particular risk. And during the pandemic, some of that was alleviated by an increase of £20 in the basic rate of universal credit, and an increase, as we've seen, in the local housing allowance. But more families have been affected by what's called the benefit cap, which is an absolute limit on the total amount of state support that families can claim. And so more families have been pushed into that, and consequently actually had their benefits reduced again. So looking ahead, that £20 increase is temporary. There may be a significant impact on families if that is removed. And there may also be an increase in families relying on state support if unemployment rises. Another question about whether there might be an increase in disability claims due to long COVID. So I'm just about on my time now, I think. I shall just leave those there in terms of things to look ahead at. The other thing, the final thing, just to finish off on saying, is that the bright spot is that actually Oxfordshire is in a strong position in many ways. You know, Oxfordshire's economic fundamentals are very strong, and some households and businesses have done very well economically in this period. So there's a question there about how we can harness that to tackle some of these problems.
Thank you, Mark. Really fascinating and yeah, really worrying. I think we're all struggling to find bright spots at the moment, aren't we? So appreciate you trying to do so for us at the end there. There's a few comments in the chat box. Please do keep them coming. Mark will be sticking around to be part of the Q&A at the end. If I could ask Mandy Richards, actually, Mark, if you could unshare your screen, thank you. And Mandy Richards, if you want to unmute yourself, could you kick off by just saying, introducing yourself and talking about the work of Agnes Smith Advice Centre, please.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. Yes, so I'm Mandy Richards. I'm the Centre Manager at the Agnes Smith Advice Centre in Blackbird Leys. So we are an independent community advice centre based in the centre of Blackbird Leys. We've been named after our first manager, Agnes Smith, who died in 2002, and she was a local resident who saw the need for advice in the area. So we've always had strong local roots. So if I just say times and then how we've adapted to cope with COVID. So we provide social welfare advice, which includes things like family issues, housing and employment. But our biggest areas of focus really are benefits and debt. So we're very much about income maximisation and helping people to find long-term solutions and reducing poverty. So always help people to apply for grants from charities for household essentials in a crisis. So all of that set up at the beginning of when the COVID crisis hit, because we've always existed to try and help people cope with changes in their financial circumstances, and we have always helped them to help them out and themselves out of a crisis. So we, at the beginning of the week, we had to switch our services. We've always been very much face-to-face, and we've switched to delivering most of our advice by phone. We've got a free phone number so people could still reach us. But we've still made the presence, have done some face-to-face advice in an emergency, and so that we've had quite a few people that just haven't had phones, so they've knocked on our door, and because we've still been there, we've then been able to get them a grant to get them a phone so that we can then phone them and get them the advice that they need. And we've worked very closely with other agencies in the local area. So in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, actually, a lot of the organisations that had helped with food weren't set up immediately to switch their services to non-face-to-face. So we had a bit of a stock of food, and we were able to, for the first couple of weeks, really focus on getting food to people. But we absolutely don't want to duplicate services. So as soon as other services like Sophia and the Community Food Bank were properly up and running, we were able to then refer to them, we obviously like to focus on the things we have the most expertise in that other people can't necessarily do, so which is the advice. But we've always, all the way through, done things like we've got a project that helps us provide people with fuel top-ups for people on prepayment meters, and I think quite a few organisations have got that up and running now. But again, we're lucky we had that in place at the start, so we've done a lot of electric top-up meters and really felt the response in Blackbird Leys.
Wonderful. I mean, it's really, really important work, and really good to hear about everything you've been doing. And I have many people who've had a grant from us through the Community Resilience Fund. Could you talk a little bit about what that's enabled?
Yeah, thanks. Very helpful. The grant, which is actually towards our core running costs. So really what it enabled us to do, it just contributed to our financial security. and it just really helped us with delivery. So my role as centre manager, because we're a very small organisation, I think we've got quite a high impact, but we're very small. And so my role is really a combination of sort of strategy and operations. Fundraising is part of my role. So because the fundraising burden was reduced, really it just meant that I was able to pitch in and focus all my time on the service delivery, which we absolutely needed, because I'm sure with all frontline organisations, we just had to, there were so many things involved to adapt the service. So our IT, given that we'd always been entirely face-to-face, and so we had to set up our IT to enable people to work from homes. We got a new telephone system so that every calls can be transferred to advisors at home. We're doing more. We've done some video calls with clients, and then we've worked really hard to make the centre COVID secure for people who are still coming in to the centre, and for staff, obviously. So screens and sanitizer and all our health and safety things. And then advisors have had a lot of keeping up to date with the changes in legislation to make sure all our advice is accurate. An endless amount of adaptation, really. So really that grant has gone a long way to allowing us to maintain the service.
Wonderful. And I mean, looking to the future, what do you think your needs are going to be in the coming month? Not to predict, probably beyond that, but what's the outlook for you?
Yeah, I still see that. I think we're going to need to be very flexible still to adapt as things develop. So we want to keep in touch with the local residents. Every year we do feedback surveys, and we contact quite a few of the people that have used us over the year to get feedback on their experiences of us, and to ask, because we're always looking at how to improve our services. We really want to do that a bit more than usual this year, to make sure that we're asking local people, what it is that they need, and to make sure that we're adapting accordingly. And for instance, I think we probably will stick with delivering some advice by phone, which we haven't really done in the past, but we think we'll keep that up, and aim to make sure that the face-to-face advice enables us to help to reach the most vulnerable clients and those with the most complex cases, because the people that come to see us are often very vulnerable. They've often got multiple issues or complex issues, and sometimes we've found there really is no substitute for face-to-face advice, and we want to make sure that gets to the people that really need it.
Thank you, Mandy. Really, really interesting to hear about your experience on the front line, and we will be coming back to you in the question and answer session, I'm sure. Our final speaker interviewee is Richard Rosser, who some of you may know because he's part of B4, and they run a very interesting series of webinars and online events as well. So, Richard, you are unmuted. Do you want to kick off by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about B4 and Nexus?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adrian, and good to see everybody this afternoon. Fantastic turnout. So B4, we're actually in our 15th year this year, so we made it through 2020, and hopefully we're actually on the cusp of expanding B4 nationally. So we've been in Oxfordshire for 15 years, and we saw this as a perfect opportunity to actually expand rather than stay as we were. I mean, B4 was traditionally pre-March, and we had a bi-monthly magazine that went out to 3,000 businesses in Oxfordshire, and we ran regular face-to-face events, places like Blenheim, Rhodes House, the Ashmolean, and a lot of the colleges. But obviously that was all halted, and you in your introduction, you said about that we run webinars. I honestly couldn't get into my head what a webinar was about this time last year, but now we've run over 250 of them, including over 100 in the space of 3 days in June. So we very quickly had to everything to the digital world. Something that we were going to do, and ironically, literally days before we went into lockdown, we had a consultation with a client, and I said it would be great to have 3 months to put the business on hold and not worry about sales and focus on converting everything to digital. And lo and behold, my wish, although it wasn't a wish in these circumstances, came true. So certainly be careful what you wish for.
Great, thank you. And do you want to say a quick word about Nexus?
Yeah, of course.
Well?
So yeah, Nexus was born pre-pandemic, and it was just an opportunity for our members. So B4 is a collection of businesses of all sizes and from all sectors, a collective of members to work with each other and profile each other and promote work that they do together. And we felt that and working with people like yourselves and people like Grant Hayward and working closely with Ben and Palace, the whole area of businesses being responsible, purposeful, etc. The old phrase of CSR, corporate social responsibility. It was important for us to provide opportunities for charities and social enterprises to actually be involved in B4. And we created, Grant came up with a name, and Nexus means a coming together, and it seemed an appropriate word. So B4 members could appoint a charity or a social enterprise to gain benefits of B4 membership at no cost, work with the other members in the B4 network and profile the work that they did with each other or they're doing with each other through our website and through the webinars, etc. So, and it's really come into its own in the last 9 months with more partnerships striking up.
Great, and I urge charities to sign up if you're not already signed up to Nexus, because I think it's a great forum. Now, obviously, we tend to think about the economic impacts from the perspective of individuals and communities, but obviously the flip side of that is businesses. So could you talk a bit about the impact that COVID and the lockdown have had on businesses in Oxfordshire?
Yeah, well, I wasn't sure on this one whether you're actually talking prosperity of employees, meaning sort of financially or sort of more their mindset, so and health and well-being. So I'm going to sort of presume that you're really focusing on the well-being and mindset of employees. I mean, in terms of businesses, obviously it depends which sector that business is in first and foremost, and we all know who the winners and losers are in business over the last 9 months. But I think a lot of it also comes down to the mindset that the business leader, the individual leading that business. We've noticed just from out of offices that there's a lot of businesses that have effectively shut up shop, and that might be because of the sector they're in, where they've had in hospitality. Some business felt maybe that the grants on offer and the furlough scheme were opportunities maybe to take a bit of a break. Maybe they weren't banking on it being as long a break, and that was something obviously none of us really knew. But I think that the upshot of all of that is, if you have been furloughed, for example, by a business owner for whatever reason, in terms of the prosperity of individuals, I think that's for some, it's been manna from heaven, and they've loved the opportunity to stay at home and be with the kids. And obviously the homeschooling is a whole new can of worms. And we had a webinar on that particular area this morning. And as a parent of 2 older kids, I looked upon parents with envy, thinking that they could spend a lot more time with their kids. But obviously there's a lot of balls to juggle when it comes to homeschooling. But I think, as I said, some people will look upon the furlough scheme as a great opportunity to not have to work and get paid. But I think we're now seeing employees coming back into businesses, and where, interestingly, there have been employees that have been furloughed and those that have carried on. And I'm specifically referring to an example I've got in mind in the hospitality sector, where one hotel had staff staying in work to look after key workers in the hotel, and then furloughed staff came back into work. There was a real clash almost of mindset, where those that had really worked non-stop during the pandemic and during lockdown were really a completely different mindset to those that came back from a fairly relaxed past 3 or 4 months off, and a bit of tension created as a result. So that's a difficult one for the business owners to manage. So I think mindset and health and well-being of employees is a massive area, a big issue for a lot of businesses that they're either managing really well or struggling to manage and cope with. And now we've got this phenomenon looking to where they can work, get staff working from home. That's going to be a huge area for businesses to have to manage going forwards. What tools are they going to provide for their staff to ensure health and well-being stays at the top of the agenda, and they're not just lost at the end of a laptop or a webinar or a call, and their mindset and well-being is really looked after.
Thank you. And I think a bit of a microcosm there about the differing impacts of lockdown and COVID on different people in different communities. And we know also, Richard, businesses have been incredibly helpful to communities through the pandemic and lockdown. And have you got a few examples for us of how businesses have been helping out?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it really depends on the business, and if the business, you might have had a lot of businesses that traditionally were really supportive of the local communities and charities, that they just can't. That their focus has been on survival, really. So I think it really depends again who the business is. I mean, looking for examples. I mean, I had a few conversations with B4 members prior to this webinar today. One of our clients, Explosive Learning Solutions, historically did an awful lot of work, litter picking at Glastonbury Festival, Poppy Day appeal, and for the Royal British Legion, and that work's continued during COVID. One of the owners at Harwell, where they're based, set up the Harwell Helpers, a mutual aid group for the village of Harwell. That's got around 100 helpers and has been involved in a multitude of tasks, from shopping to prescription runs and friendly calls. The business themselves has delivered flowers and Meals on Wheels, made face masks and scrub bags, as well as visors and clips, which have been delivered straight into the local NHS. And more recently, they've turned to a recycle and refurbish service, ensuring all the children in the village had computers for homeschooling. And now Kath Convery, one of the directors, takes a day off a week to continue to support coordination of these initiatives and has supported the logistics for the vaccination scheme in Didcot. And on top of all of that, they've also helped with fundraising events for children in need, to pass donations to the local food bank. So I just want to use that one example. There's plenty, and those on the call today will have been involved in, supported or initiated a lot of fantastic initiatives. But I just think that ELS maybe encompasses a lot of the good things that have happened from businesses over the past year.
Great, thank you. And finally, I mean, do you think there are any businesses who have changed their mindset as a result of the pandemic and thinking differently about how they want to engage with communities in the future?
I think that's really interesting that you pulled that mindset out of the question, because I think there will have been businesses that would have always done this. And I talk about Kath at ELS, that would have continued to have done this. There will be those that have done it in the past, supported local initiatives, but have because of the pressures on their business not been able to, and that must have been incredibly frustrating for them. But I think there'll also be that third group that maybe wasn't that inclined to support the local communities and charities, that have not necessarily been forced to, but have maybe been carried away with things like support for the NHS and the clapping, and got carried away on the crest of that wave, felt good about it and thought, actually, this is good for me, for my own mindset, for my own well-being. It's good for the business to be involved in these sorts of initiatives. And I think hopefully they will replace those that can no longer do it because of, as I said, the pressures on their businesses. And hopefully we'll end up with at least the same amount of organisations being able to support their local communities as there were before. And hopefully that will continue as businesses start to recover and repair the damage that has been done to them over the course of the next 6, 12, 18, 5 years. It's going to months and years. It's going to take a lot of time to recover, but hopefully the mindset has shifted significantly to one of support and collaboration and looking after those less fortunate than a lot of us. And let's face it, a lot of us have got away relatively unscathed. A lot of groups on this call today would have been at the coalface and seen the real harsh realities and impacts of COVID. And I think it's down to all of us to really work together going forward to help each other recover as best as possible.
Wonderful, thank you, Richard. And I can see there's been numerous comments and a few people saying they've been part of Nexus and have really valued it. So that's really good to see. Kate, what else is popping up in the chat box that we might want to pick up on?
Yeah, lots of endorsement of what Richard said, actually, that people are finding that businesses have been really supportive of them, particularly in supplying laptops and that kind of thing. There's one interesting question here about pensions, a question for Mark, I think, about how service users of charities who are very dependent on pensions, will they be at all affected economically by this crisis?
Is that one for me? I presume it is for me.
Mark.
I think.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, well, I hope it's not for me because I'm not an expert on that. So.
Yeah, no, for Mark, Richard.
Thank God.
Mandy may have something to say on it as well. I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I'm especially an expert on that either. I think what I would say is that, pension incomes have done, certainly state pension incomes have done very well in the last 10 years. Actually, that is, if you like, one of the bright spots of social policy over the last 10 years, is that there's been a real commitment by governments to increase pensioners' incomes and reduce the incidence of pensioner poverty, which hasn't been eradicated, but it's a lot less of a problem than it used to be. And I think this is a social policy success that we should celebrate. The flip side of that is that child poverty has become much more of an issue and much more of a problem. And I think politically, not that I'm saying we want to return to pensioner poverty, but we do need to refocus our efforts on the problems for younger people. That said, the question was about the economic impacts for older people. I mean, I'm not sure, but I would guess that potentially for older people who were struggling and living in poorly heated times with very high fuel costs and so forth, this period where they really haven't been able to get out and go elsewhere and so forth, potentially could have made them struggle even more, I would guess, from an economic point of view in terms of managing those costs. But yeah, if anyone else got any thoughts on that, we'd be interested to hear them.
Do you want me to? Yeah, I think what Mark said is right, that we tend to know with pensioners that if we get them all the money that they're entitled to, that they're in with a good chance of balancing their budget, and sadly that isn't the case for younger people. And one thing is that the pension age is rising, so there are a higher number. You're still working age now if you're 64, 65, so you're still going to be on the lower income, perhaps on universal credit, things that we still see around. I think there have been quite a lot of good things introduced by the government that Mark was talking about. So like the £20 a week increase on universal credit, the rise in the local housing allowance, and they've had a really beneficial impact on some of the people that we've seen. But the really bad things are where you could have had a family where they've been in some work and they've only maybe fairly recently found a job, but then they lost it again as a result of the pandemic. And not only are they then without that job, but they're also then benefit capped because because all their income's coming from benefit. And that's such an arbitrary, punishing thing, the benefit cap. It just means that their income is set at an amount that nobody could live on. They then have to apply to the council for a discretionary housing payment to top up their income, but that's usually only for about 3 months. The council don't like doing that indefinitely. So you get people then really struggling. And similarly with families where there have been children born after April 2017, if that's a third child, they're not going to get an amount of benefit for that child. They'll get child benefit, but they won't get anything in universal credit, and they really struggle as well.
Thank you, Mandy. Kate, anything else we want to pick up from the chat?
A question for Mandy about whether you've seen an increase in people using your services, and has there been a significant change in the sorts of things that people are seeking help with?
Thanks. Yeah, there has. Well, I look back at the figures for January this year. The numbers we saw were up by about 40% from the same period last year, and also about 40% of the clients for January were new people as well. So it also seems to come back to 40%. About 40% of the new people we saw had COVID-related inquiries, and I think in terms of what people are coming to us for, there's similar things to what we've always seen people for, that they've drops in income and sudden changes in circumstances. But it's probably a broader range of people because it's being impacted by COVID. I think one of the things I hope that will come out of this as well is that I do think there's a lot of goodwill around at the moment to people, and I think what I'm really hoping is there's much less talk about strivers and skivers, and that people will realise that, you know, difficult circumstances, change in fortunes can happen to anyone, and that we will see going forwards, we'll see a little bit of a change in the rhetoric.
Yeah, I can echo that. I think there's an opportunity and a change in people's mindsets that means we do think differently about disadvantage and are much more aware than we maybe were of how at risk we all are of succumbing to it. As you know, I know people in my age group are very unlikely to die from COVID, but there are a reasonably significant number who are experiencing long COVID, and the effects and impacts of that are, I think, we're only starting to understand and are potentially quite scary for individuals. So Kate, the final comment or question from the chat box before we wrap
I think
up?
Yeah, a question sort of in relation to that, actually, about whether people feel that there are some businesses that will cease to exist. Whether Richard, I guess, maybe has a sort of feel from the business community, or certainly in terms of having to lay off their employees, that kind of relates, I guess, to this affecting more people.
Sorry, Kate, you sort of cut out then as you were asking the question.
Sorry, my internet is a bit unstable today. It's a question about whether you have feedback from the business community about whether some businesses will cease to exist as a result of this.
Oh, definitely. I think that's without doubt, and there are businesses that definitely have had to close their doors, unfortunately. But I think recent stats have come out saying how many new businesses have started up as well. Those that have maybe been made redundant have decided to change career and set up their new business. So I think, and a lot of people looking for a completely change in career and thinking, you know, what I've been doing for the last 20 years really isn't fulfilling me anymore. Life is too short. I want to do something that I've always wanted to do. Now's the opportunity to do it. So there's certainly winners and losers, as I said from the outset, but definitely, yeah, businesses will be closing, unfortunately.
And as you were pretty concise there, Richard, just a quick follow-up. Do you know of local businesses doing anything and picking up on the youth issue that Mark was highlighting earlier, in terms of apprenticeships for young people and trying to get young people into work? And I know there's also potentially government schemes that can help subsidise that. So that kind of off the cuff. But
yeah, no, we're very aware. I saw one of the comments in the chat about Kickstart. We're very aware of the scheme. We tried to actually get onto it, but we couldn't, unfortunately. But we're in contact with a number of gateways. I know Aspire in Oxford are a gateway, and it's working really well for getting those that have to be on universal credit to qualify. But it's a great way to get the next generation into work. You get covered for 6 months. And then it's up to you whether you want to take that particular employee on full time. Apprenticeships, I'd highly recommend it. We've actually just taken on an apprentice this week. First time we've taken on an apprentice on Monday. Very smooth process, and there's a lot of very capable young people out there. So I really do urge everybody, if they've been considering it, to really follow through and appoint an apprentice. It's really well worth it.
Great. Well, thank you, Richard, for your contributions. Thank you, Mandy, and thank you, Mark. It's been another really fascinating session. I can see there's been a lot of comments in the chat about digital exclusion and laptops and other electronic devices, which is a very nice lead into our next session on March the 24th, which will be looking at digital exclusion, the digital divide, and what we can do to try and bridge that. So do sign up and come along again in a month. And in the meantime, thank you very much for coming today. And I do hope you enjoy the sunshine that's forecast in the next few days, if you're managing to get out and about. Thank you, everyone.